Okay, so we might get into it because we've got quite the packed agenda today. So before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge country. So I'm joining you today from the land of the Wanju Nyungar people, but I know that some of you might be in very different lands today. So I want to pay respects to elders past and present from all of the lands which we're joining from today. And especially in the context of this session, which we're talking about place and regions. And I think we're very lucky for the extraordinary job that Aboriginal communities and the ACO and Aboriginal health sectors did in responding to the COVID crisis and making sure to keep the Aboriginal communities and elders safe. So WACOS Wednesdays at 1 is what we hope will be an ongoing free weekly webinar series for our members, but also for the broader community services sector, into our initial thinking about some of the challenges facing the community services sector in WA. And in this first set of 8 webinars, we're talking about what an inclusive plan for recovery needs to look like for Western Australia in order to make sure that we're leaving no one behind. Each webinar features a presentation from WACOS and some of our key partners, followed by opportunities for questions and conversation. So we will be using the breakout room function for Zoom a bit later in the conversation. So I just encourage you to, at that point, have your video on, don't be muted, and engage as thoroughly as you can in the conversations. In terms of Zoom etiquette, if you can remain on mute whilst the presentations are happening, but if you can keep your video on, that's great. We'd love to see you. It's great to see everyone's faces. And please do just be ready to participate in those group conversations later on in the session. For today's session on regional place-based recovery and community wealth building, we're partnering with Linkwest, which is the peak body for community neighbourhood centres and CRCs across Western Australia. And so welcome to Jane Chilcott, the CEO of Linkwest. We're also leveraging the internal knowledge and experience of WACOS's Pilbara manager Celeste and our senior policy officer Graham. So it's a pretty packed session, so I will jump straight into it with a couple of opening statements. So Ashley, if we can go to the next slide. So if we think about what we've been through in terms of COVID-19 crisis response and that emergency response, and now this move into recovery, there's quite a different feel, I guess, and culture related to those kinds of phases. So in an emergency response, it's very much command and control, and there's a strong legislative framework surrounding that emergency response. And then when we think about recovery, we're really going into an area of thinking about local, inclusive and community development type approaches. Note, however, that Western Australia has a state-led or state, I guess in some senses controlled response to the recovery effort. And so there's a webinar about this previously, which I'll send out with the materials after this webinar, which talks a little bit more detail about the state's recovery plan and what that structure looks like. So I guess in this webinar, we want to explore what impact could that have on local communities, and how do we make sure that we don't lose the opportunity that we have now, really for what we've seen, for communities to take ownership and control over what kind of places they want to live in, and what they want to, I guess, create for their neighbourhoods and places where they're living. So, we saw a lot of volunteers in local communities putting their hand up and just wanting to be involved, wanting to support their neighbours and people in their place. We saw, the entire support and for essential workers, and a lot of Facebook groups popping up about healthcare workers and wanting to support people in the area, contributing to the COVID-19 emergency response. So I guess today we're trying to explore, okay, well, in moving to recovery, how do we leverage some of that community sentiment to really get them to reflect on how we can continue that and not just forget about it in thinking about recovery. Next slide, Ashley. And so this is just a snapshot of the National Disaster Recovery Principles, which are principles that are used also by state and local governments. And I just wanted to highlight the one there, the third one down, which talks about using community-led approaches. And so the kinds of things we'll talk about today are, written into the kinds of legislative frameworks and responses that our governments have at all levels. And so that's why I guess this is really important stuff, and being clear about what we want to see in local place-based regional recovery is really important. Next slide. Oh, so I think now I'm passing on to Celeste. So Celeste, if you want to kick off.
Yeah, thanks, Kylie. I'm hoping everyone can see me or hear me at least here. I would also just very quickly like to acknowledge the land that I am on today, the land of the Ngarluma people in the Pilbara region, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging here. So really, I just wanted to touch on the Pilbara experience and what happened as soon as COVID hit and up until this day, that there has been a real great concern for our more remote communities, ensuring that they have the food and shelter that they need and other essential services. There was a lot of door-to-door, particularly for services that primarily had people coming to them. They then transitioned to outreach, which is really great to see, and physically going to homes. So YIC is the Youth Involvement Council in Hedland. They were literally hand delivering food and education packs to the young people. And it gave them an opportunity to check in on the families that were there. So that was a really nice example. Greater collaboration between services to look after our most vulnerable was an absolute must, and has been really nice to see services that may have not previously worked together really coming to the table. Developing easily discernible resources, videos and content in different languages and modes of delivery was paramount, particularly when we do have such a broad a cohort of language groups across the region as well. Go next slide. Yeah, so this I just wanted to put up here. It was a really great example of one of the local Aboriginal corporations saying we do need a really coordinated approach to this. It was about building that community, building that support network of services coming together to identify the areas of need and providing on-the-ground support for our most vulnerable, which was really nice. And there was a big conference call that happened between a lot of the organisations that they met weekly. We had a couple of services coming together that had a bit of support from industry partners as well, to be able to deliver these boxes to families as well around Roban and surrounding communities, which was really lovely. Go next slide. We also have an Aboriginal Interagency collaboration, which is run by IBN, but also the Pilbara Aboriginal Voice and their community members, which was really fantastic. So these are a bunch of services all coming together. We're now meeting monthly, talking about what are the issues that we're seeing, but how can we respond collectively, not relying on other external parties or state or federal government to help. This is all about developing and working together as a team. Next slide. Another example would be the Pilbara Family and Domestic Violence Network. I'm fortunate enough to be facilitating this, but it's really about getting people to work together to build positive families where everyone can live safely in their homes and community. So really leveraging the opportunity at the moment where we're working together. We've got grants available that are with COVID recovery. And we have all these people involved. So we've got refuges, not-for-profits, health services, AMSs, industry bodies, and it goes on. And particularly being led by people with lived experience. So it gains a whole bunch of different perspectives in leading a sustainable solution throughout our recovery of COVID. Next. This just gives you an idea of how many services we actually have in the Pilbara and how we really need to be working together to address and promote early intervention and prevention so that these issues such as family domestic violence don't exacerbate or aren't exacerbated during potentially another second wave or as we go further into our recovery. Next slide. These are just some examples of the types of tailored resources that we had. So community-facing resources that I was able to develop for our local services and also community members to be able to know exactly where they can go for help around each of their communities. So the way to get help during COVID was, one was developed for each local government area. And then we had an overall Pilbara health and AOD service. which gave a really nice resource for services to be able to know who they can rely on within communities. Next slide. A couple of local government things happened, which was really exciting. So we had Meet the Street, which is, you know, people being able to access $200 from their local government to host a street party. So as we're coming into recovery, it's all about getting to know your neighbours, building that rapport. We have Try Local cash vouchers, so supporting our local businesses, where each household actually received $100 in their mail to go and spend at a local business, which is really great. Great support. Next slide. In Hedland and Newman, we also have a lot of community-based projects happening. So again, another one about getting to know your neighbours, so StreetNet. This was run through Hedland Collective as well. So there's that community card you could post in each other's letterboxes saying, I can help you with this. Just being being an olive branch, really sticking out and up for your neighbours and being a supporting hand through this. And then we have that getting neighbourly to win. So in the Shire of East Pilbara, being able to as well get some funding to be able to connect with neighbours, hosting a barbecue or something like that. Next slide. Yeah, so I just wanted to quickly finish on opportunities. So really, all these local activation activities are a great way to develop that sense of community, prioritising place-based responses, so not relying on state or government initiatives, that we actually have the ability to do it ourselves. And this is what works, and what we can see that people are working better together because they're reaching out and knowing and taking it into their own hands, and they can see their fingerprints on the outcome. It's not driven by someone else. We're working to people's strengths and ultimately what they care about. And then also thinking about what assets as a service provider or someone that is coming to the region can you add value to, rather than coming in with the answers. Another big piece would be aligning government initiatives, grants and tenders, and other people or other funding bodies that, you know, developing that same language of prioritising locally led initiatives. So rather than looking at it from a what's the problem and how can we give you money to fix it, looking at what's working well and how can we strengthen and build on that. So yeah, translating messages to be strengths focused. Using that asset-based appreciative inquiry discourse, it gets people thinking through a certain lens to be able to see themselves as, you know, I actually have the answers and I can do this. They're seen through a more positive lens rather than always coming at it from a deficit point of view, which is, I think, a really beautiful thing that's come from COVID, and recognizing that people actually have, you know, gifts and abilities to be able to work on. And then also as a service provider or someone coming into the region, asking the question of how do we support you to support yourself? I think that is also a really nice perspective on taking as we move into that recovery.
That's great. Thanks, Celeste. I think it's great for us to start with a specific place and what's kind of happened through the emergency response and now looking into recovery. And I guess Celeste had that perspective of not only being in a place, but also, you know, systemically, how we're bringing together different service providers in that place. So, you know, bridging, I guess, that traditional service system response with the community-driven response as well, which leads really nicely into Jane Chilcott, who will be our next speaker. I was going to ask for questions, but because Jane will also speak to a couple of specific places, I might just get Jane to go first and then see if anyone's got any questions for Jane or Celeste afterwards. And just one more thing I forgot to mention in the introduction, if you have some comments to make or you have some questions, please feel free to make use of the chat function. We sometimes have quite robust conversations happening in the chat function at the same time, so feel free to make use of that. So Jane, I'll pass over to you.
Great, thank you, Kylie, and hello everyone. Lovely to be here, and I saw a lot of very familiar names and places who are attending today. So Linkwest is the peak body for what we call neighbourhood and community resource centres, and I think many of you are very familiar with them. We have 150 place-based community-run organisations that we support and advocate for. And on average, across our sector, those centres are funded between, well, the average centre is funded of just over 100,000 per annum, and that's for everything. But they generally earn an income between 100,000 and 500,000 per annum. And that's money that's spent locally. It also represents employees, 750 employees across WA, which is less than 5%, but again, those are jobs in those local places. Currently, there are about 80 trainees across the network, and over the years, since the traineeship program went into place, there's been more than 500 trainees that have completed their traineeship. So that's jobs and skills, local jobs and skills, and keeping people employed locally. And volunteering, on average, 15 volunteers volunteer per centre per week and contribute at 4.5 to 5 hours per week. So that's the volunteer contribution, economic contribution that happens at a local level in all of those 150 places. Next slide, please. An SROI, social return on investment, done in Victoria for 20 centres demonstrated that for every dollar invested in a neighbourhood centre, community resource centre, generated just under $3 in value. So there's a small amount of money that's invested into community-led building and community-led development actually generates a significant value add. And I think that's the key thing to recognise that I wanted to sort of get across here today, that we're not, when we talk about community-led development, that is not separate to economic development. They go hand in hand, because in asset-based community development, where that we're building on what's strong, what's wrong in community, it inevitably leads to economic development as well. It's about community doing it for themselves, with support potentially from other agencies. So in terms of income generation across the regions, our members would generate on average $55,000 per year, or 27% of their income, and that's a range of very typical activities that they would undertake to generate an income. So it's about money being invested into a local community, being kept in a local community, supporting local businesses, local services, and then attracting more money into community through community-led initiatives and community-led development. And as Celeste has really highlighted of what happened in the Pilbara, that's done through partnerships, strong partnerships with local government authorities and the multiple other associations and community organisations across an area. And our members are hyper-local organisations. So I want to give you some examples, not COVID ones, but of where some of our members have used an asset-based community development approach, which has led to economic and wealth building. So next slide, please. So this is the Welcome to Country mural Esperance, and this was a partnership between S-Care Incorporated, Esperance Community Arts, the Seawater families, and with the support of the local Aboriginal corporation. This beautiful mural, which you can see in Esperance, now part of the Esperance Art Trail. This is multiple years of small grants, community activity that has led to multiple different events and activities by multiple different associations, ultimately leading to this mural as part of the arts trail. And this is now actually attracting people into Esperance to go on the arts trail to see the mural. And what it's also done is the other outcomes and the original outcomes, the original intention was about building community, breaking down cultural barriers, and the byproduct of this has also been a much stronger relationship with the local shire, the local government authority. Next slide, please. This is Koorda Drive-In. So the Koorda Drive-In has been running now, I think, for nearly 3 years. It's just such a beautiful picture. This was a partnership between the local businesses, local government authority, the P&C at the school, and tourism providers. Over 2 years, they attracted 6,000 visitors, and in first 6 months of last year, they sold 744 tickets, bringing in nearly $67,000 worth of income to the community. And the other, so this was an economic generation activity, but it resulted in upskilling residents. And the money that the P&C raised through running the canteen has resulted in every student in the local primary school having an iPad and every classroom having an interactive whiteboard. Next slide, please. So Milligan is a centre in Bunbury, neighbourhood centre in Bunbury. They wanted to start a community choir, pub choir, which they did. So this was a mental health project, but this mental health project has resulted in over 12 months, 1,400 people enjoying the power of collective joy. A local business benefiting once a month from all these people coming in, and local artists have been invited to come along and facilitate the choir events. So it's an opportunity to highlight and showcase local artists and for them to get some exposure. So so a side benefit has been the economic outcome. And next slide, please. So this Wellstead CRC is in a very small community on the road down to Albany. Wellstead CRC was at risk of losing its funding a couple of years ago, and when they thought they were going to lose their funding, one of the members of staff thought they were going to have to leave and move to get a job elsewhere. That would have resulted in them removing their children from the local primary school, which would have taken the intake to below a critical level, which may have resulted in the closure of the primary school. Fortunately, they didn't lose their funding, and the community came together and decided to create Whisper Cafe. And I think if we can, we'll just show you a little video of what the community achieved through that cafe.
Amazing. Thanks, Jane, for sharing some of those stories. That made me really hungry for cake now. But that's okay, it's fine, we'll keep going. 2 o'clock's come around the corner. And so I think some of those individual stories really give us a sense of, you know, how can we make sure we're balancing this state-led strategy and recovery with, you know, a community-driven, hopefully assets-based community-driven response. So before I jump to Graham, I just wanted to see if anyone had any questions or comments on the things that Celeste and Jane have spoken about so far. If I'm not seeing you, you can just unmute and start talking. No? Okay, we might have some more after Graham speaks. So Graham's now going to speak about an element of this, which is place-based, but a little bit, I guess, adjacent in terms of being a kind of a new series of, not a new series, a whole bunch of different words and language. So I'll just hand over to Graham to go through that.
Thanks, Kylie, and thanks everyone for being on the webinar today. What I want to talk to you about now is how we can take some of those great case studies and examples that Celeste and Jane have just provided and elevate them into a systems-wide approach that can regenerate and transform regional economies. So the Democracy Collaborative defines community wealth building as a systems approach to economic development that creates inclusive, sustainable economy built on locally rooted and broadly held ownership. Building on the grassroots economic development approach of the Basque region and its Mondragon Corporation, a federation of worker cooperatives, what has become known as community wealth building initially came to prominence in the American city of Cleveland with the Evergreen Cooperative Initiative, established there to revitalise the local economy. This approach has since been taken up by the Preston City Council in the United Kingdom, which had become a stark example of the decline and neglect of regional centres following the deindustrialisation of the UK's north. The council took the Cleveland model and developed it even further to become a holistic framework that integrates community, cooperative and public assets into a mutually supporting system. Next slide, please, Ashley. The approach begins with an emphasis on the procurement activities of what are referred to as anchor institutions. These institutions are significant features within their local areas and are unlikely to shift, like local government authorities, hospitals, schools, and universities. Importantly, these are institutions which employ a significant number of people and which spend a lot of money through procurement and other processes. Wherever possible, these anchor institutions are encouraged to shift their external spending towards local procurement in order to relocalise their spending and keep it within the community. What makes community wealth building more than simply a local procurement strategy, though, which I note that the state government has already been doing a lot of work around, is the importance that community wealth building places on democratising economic ownership. Next slide, please. Community wealth building promotes models of ownership that enables the wealth created by users or consumers, workers and local communities to be held within those communities, rather than disappearing as profits for shareholders. In practice, this looks like establishing and supporting models like worker-owned cooperatives and community ownership structures throughout the supply chains of those anchor institutions. These are of critical importance as it ensures that the benefits of business ownership are spread widely. I won't go into too much detail on the value and role of cooperatives, as Kylie is running a webinar in a couple of weeks' time looking at that very topic, other than to say worker-owned cooperatives play a critical role in building community wealth by creating quality, empowering jobs for community members, keeping profits remaining and circulating within the whole community by spreading the economic benefits as broadly as possible and developing democratic, grassroots decision-making skills. Next slide, please. The impact of this community wealth building in Preston has been clear. By 2016, 3 years after the project had begun, spending by 6 key anchor institutions had risen from 5% within Preston and 39% in Lancashire more generally to 19% within Preston and 81% in Lancashire. Through this work, they've managed to bring back around £70 million worth of contracts into Preston's local economy, with that going up to £200 million that has been added to what has been retained in the wider regional economy. Where the local economy was unable to meet the procurement needs of those anchor institutions, the City Council advocated for and assisted with the creation of worker-owned cooperatives, developing an incubator for what they've called GAP co-ops. They're now looking to establish a community-owned bank, so there is access to capital loyal to the local area, and to create a city-owned green energy company as well, in order to provide affordable, sustainable power for the local community. The benefits have been more than just economic. Through the democratisation of their local economy, Preston has been able to reinvigorate a sense of community and belonging for the local residents. And in 2018, it was named the most improved city in the UK. Next slide, please. While community wealth building is fundamentally a place-based strategy that centres community self-determination, and as such, it won't look the same in every place. Through its work with the Preston City Council, the UK Centre for the Local Economic Strategies has developed 5 basic principles which underpin the approach. The first is plural ownership of the economy. As I've discussed, this means supporting and investing in locally based and community-led ownership structures for businesses and assets like co-ops and community boards. The second principle is making financial power work for local places. Instead of the focus being on attracting national and international finance, community wealth building seeks to tap into the capital of those local anchor institutions we mentioned earlier, recirculating the wealth that exists within the local economy, investing in local schemes. The third principle is fair employment and just markets. Community wealth building recognises that labour matters more than capital. As some of the largest employers in local communities, anchor institutions need to be providing a living wage, targeting jobs towards lower income areas, and ensuring fair work conditions. The fourth principle is progressive procurement of goods and services. The procurement practices of those anchor institutions can decisively shape the local economy through their supply chains. By ensuring social, economic, and environmental well-being is considered as part of their procurement processes, we can provide a boost in those areas for those communities. The final principle is socially productive or socially just use of land and property. In order for the whole community to benefit, value cannot just be captured by private interests. This means ensuring that assets are managed in such a way so they generate wealth for the local community, including through developing structures where communities can more actively participate and control the management of common assets. This could look like the model for what has been termed public common partnerships, where common associations made up of local community members govern the asset jointly with local or state governments, unions, and public institutions. I'll leave you just one last thing. While you have to start somewhere, for community wealth building to really work, it has to be more than just one or two projects. It needs to be taken as a whole of systems approach in an area that is generally intended to transform a local economy. We know that business as usual does not work for the majority of people, and this is a model for how we could do things differently.
That's great, thanks Graham. And I really liked how you made the link much better than I did around, a system perspective or a system application of some of the things that Celeste and Jane spoke about. So before we move on, does anyone have any questions for Graham? Because community wealth building, I think, is something that some of you might have had some exposure to, but others might not have. So any questions around community wealth building?
Kylie, I've just got something. It's Jane here. In very small towns like Wellstead, the anchor institution might be the CRC. And in a lot of those small towns, our community resource centres, the neighbourhood centres, or the local government authority are the employer of choice, sometimes the only large employer.
Yep, absolutely. And I think exactly based on the size of the community and the context of the community, the anchor institutions will be a little bit different. But, I think one of the key things that was highlighting what Graham mentioned was that local governments are probably likely to be anchor institutions right around the state. So great. Okay, if there's no further kind of questions, what I might do now is pop into the chat a link to a Google Doc. So it's a shared Google Doc. You literally click on the link and you can access it. And in that is the two questions that I'm hoping that we can now address in the breakout session. So this is an opportunity, I guess, for WACOS and for Linkwest and anyone else on the call really to test some of the things that we've been thinking in terms of recovery and I guess the asks that we've been making of the state government in that process. And so the two questions I've got here to guide the conversation, but having said that, feel free to take the conversation anywhere where your group wants to take it, is what are some of the community-led initiatives that started in the pandemic that we want to keep, and how do we make sure that happens? So one of the key things that we've been seeing and starting to talk about recovery, particularly in regions and place-based recovery, is the stories, just wanting to capture the different stories and examples of excellent work that's already been happening. And the second question is, how can organisations empower, enable or support people in communities to step up and take ownership of what their recovery process looks like at a local level? So I will give you probably about 10 minutes now in smaller groups. If you need to leave at any point, that's okay. And then if it leaves only a few people in a group, I will kind of put you into another group. So just, keep an eye on your screen. If I'm asking you to go into another room, it's just because I'm hoping to give you a better quality conversation. So I'll pop you in the rooms now. So just to create a bit of a space for anyone who wants to share some of the key elements that came out of their group conversation.
Our group was, there was an interesting focus, which was how large corporations changed from rhetoric around supporting local to actually, their behaviour changed to actually supporting local, and there seemed to be a much greater element of trust between, you know, where large corporations gave money to local community groups and effectively trusted them to use it in the best interest of the community, without feeling that they had to determine, you know, have too much control over it. And so they were hoping that that level of trust between large corporations and local community organizations will be kept.
Mm. Yeah, that's great. I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think we absolutely want to ensure that, you know, any community that large corporations are operating in, that they're responsibly and seriously about the impact in that community. But in my breakout room, we were also talking about the fact that a lot of dollars can be lost to the large corporations who, in effect, their shareholders are likely to be over east or international, and so that that cash is funneling out of the local community, when if we were, you know, using local businesses and, you know, the small guys in the local community, then the money's staying in the community. So it's a hard one, isn't it, to kind of bridge. Anyone else want to share anything out of this session?
Nicole from Mural. I think we heard that local governments are trying their hardest to look after their citizens and not reducing rates. They're offering facilities for free. They're doing a lot of things that they didn't used to do in the past. They're also struggling because they don't have a rates rise. So just for us to be aware that we think it sucks for us, but our local governments are really trying their hardest, that I can see around the regions and cities and whatnot, to support their residents as well. So really everyone is trying the best that they can with the resources they have. So that's what I got from our little session.
Thanks, Nicole. And I think in addition to that, we, I think it was Leslie at City of Albany was also speaking about the fact that all of this focus we've got at a state level on construction means that there's a massive influx to local governments around building permits and approvals and things, whilst that resource also doesn't exist. So, you know, I guess that connection that we were talking about state-led recovery and how that plays out at a local level hasn't probably been considered as well as it could have been in that respect. Any other final reflections?
I had one about the opportunity to use the funding that's available through the COVID response through Lottery West and Healthway. That it's, while there's a lot of emphasis there on emergency response funding, and let's not forget, we might think we're over the emergency, but we're not. We're in the stage before the emergency comes back, and there will be more emergency down the track. The emergency funding that's available can be used for things that will provide ongoing capacity to communities as well. An example being one that I was involved in drafting with Western Desert Lands Aboriginal Corporation, where we got funding about $600,000 for accommodation, for transitional accommodation in the communities for quarantining for 14 days. But that's accommodation that will then be able to be used as ongoing improvement to the housing stock for the long term. And I think we should be on the lookout for opportunities like that to take advantage of the funding that's available around the COVID stuff and use it for ongoing resilience kind of stuff.
Yeah, great points, Stuart. Thinking about not only how are we, you know, responding directly now, but how is it helping us over the longer term? Really good point. So I might just bring us to a close there. So I've just popped into the chat. If you happen to have a second now, we'd really appreciate your input and evaluation of the webinar series. We're hoping to do it longer term. And so we just need to know if we're on the right track and if there's things we should be changing if we do that. But that will also be emailed out to you along with the PowerPoint slides from today. And also the recording will be made available on our website in about a week or so. But again, that link will come out to you after the webinar. So thank you, all of you, for sticking out there till the end. I think some people get a bit scared off by group conversation, but we really appreciate it. The group conversations are a really important part of what we're trying to do here. And so have a great rest of the day.